I think if you stop kind of being creative and writing and using that muscle, you kind of lose that muscle. And I think that's what had happened. And so I wasn't getting all these ideas anymore of like what I was going to make.
And how long was the original script?
The feature script, was, I don't know, 100 pages or something, and I think it's turned into a hour and 40-minute movie, I think. Yeah.
Was it originally called Borrego?
Yep, it's always been called Borrego. It's I hate naming things. Like, I'm actually horrible at picking titles and names for things, so my names are never that original. But Borrego is the name of the desert that the movie takes place in, and then in Spanish it also means like lamb or sheep, and that's kind of has a connection also to the character and kind of some of the story. So it made sense, and in the end, it kind of became this word that not everyone even knows how to say it, and it's kind of confusing, but it's a little mysterious, and I think it kind of works. It works for the film and draws people in, I guess. Who knows? We'll see, I guess.
Oh, I like it. And the Anza Borrego Desert is right where like San Diego and Baja California sort of crossover, or?
Exactly. It's Anza Borrego Desert is kind of where the U.S.-Mexico border meets on one side, surrounded by kind of the mountains next to San Diego on the other side, and then the Salton Sea on the other side. So it's really this kind of no man's land of sorts of California, where it's this huge desert area that has very little population, really almost no towns. It's just this massive desert. Most of it is this state park. But it's a beautiful landscape, stunning deserts, and there really isn't a lot filmed there. My parents had been going there to kind of escape the Seattle winters, and so I would go and visit them, and that's how I kind of got introduced to this landscape. And it just seemed like a really compelling place for a movie to take place.
What's the premise for Borrego?
So the premise for Borrego is it's about a young botanist who moves to this really small town in the middle of the California desert. She's there to study this invasive plant that's growing out in the wild, in the desert. And she's kind of leaving some things in her life behind. And so she decides to go and take this job for several months to be alone out in the desert. And while she's there, she's deep out in the middle of the desert by herself. The sun's going down. She's getting ready to go drive back to town for the night. And all of a sudden, this little tiny airplane, like an ultralight plane, crashes right next to where she is in the desert. And she goes over to see if this person's alive, if she can help. And he is alive, but there's these packages of drugs scattered across the desert floor. And she realizes that he's survived, but he's basically going to shoot her and kill her, take her truck, and go and keep driving these drugs to where he was supposed to be flying this plane. But she convinces him that, he has no idea where he is. It's the middle of the desert. It's the middle of the night. There are no roads. She's only been there a few days, but she tells him that she knows this desert like the back of her hand, and that if he doesn't kill her, she'll help him get to where he's going. And so they eventually basically end up using each other to survive and get out of the desert. Meanwhile, the person who was supposed to receive these drugs is like, where are these drugs? And goes in to go find him. And there's a few other characters, the sheriff of the town, his daughter. And even though the film is kind of set in this drug border world kind of story, and that's everything I just explained, but that's really not what the movie's about. The movie is really this movie of survival and choices that people make. And from the beginning, I really didn't want to make a drug movie. That's really not what this is. It's really this kind of more personal movie of the choices you make and how those impact basically the rest of your life or the other people kind of around you. And the movie's kind of this just compelling thriller basically in the desert. Lots of action, lots of emotion, and hopefully a fun and entertaining movie.
And you wrote it for a female protagonist?
Yeah, I think so. The original idea for the movie came about because my dad is this amateur botanist, and he was out in the desert in this real area, Borrego Springs, and he had found with some of the people, he had found this invasive plant that was growing. And this is a very tiny little town. It's not even its official city. It's like unincorporated San Diego County. And so they were going to basically try to get a grant and bring a botanist in to come and study this and help them figure out how to eradicate it. And he told me that, and I was like, this is an amazing setup for why someone would come to a town. And so from there, I started building out this idea of, what would someone be running away from, and why would someone come to this town? And um, and then after that, kind of found an article about a drug plane that had crashed somewhat nearby that desert, and that they were using these ultralights, which are basically like gliders with a little tiny engine, like very janky little planes, because they fly so low and slow, they don't really get picked up by the radar, like a real plane would. But they also crash easily because they're really homemade sometimes and carrying lots of drugs. And so I kind of put those two together. I knew that to make a kind of commercial appealing film that I needed to have some sort of aspect like that into it. But I didn't want to make a border movie or a drug movie. I wanted to make a really personal movie of survival and choices. And so that's kind of just what sets up this whole action and becomes then a more intimate film about this botanist. And yeah, I don't know. From the beginning, she was always a female character. That wasn't like I was like, oh, I got to make a female character. It was more just, I guess, what made sense. And I think quickly became really compelling. I mean, my mom was a super strong, like, woman. And so I think I also just grew up like around that. And so I don't know. I think it felt so, I guess, natural to me, which doesn't make sense because I'm a man, but it felt almost more natural to write that than to write it as a guy.
Sure, and the stakes are higher in some sense because she's got to survive, and there's a fear element and things.
For sure. And no, I mean, it becomes a really kind of interesting dynamic, in the desert, and it's, a lot of people would expect it to become like a love story or something like that, and it doesn't have any of that. It's really kind of this story of what are you willing to do, how much are you going to fight for what you want, and what are those choices you're going to make to kind of go one way or the other.
How many feature scripts had you written prior to Borrego, and how did you know this was the right one to spend time with?
So I think this was the third feature script I had written. The first was the one I made when I was 17 and made this feature film instead of going to college. And then I wrote another one a few years after that with someone else. And it was a cool story, but nothing really came from it. And then I went and stopped basically my own film career and ran this film festival for young directors for 7-8 years. And then I started directing commercials. And so I kind of got out of this path of writing, and you kind of lose. I think when I was doing the festival, especially, I was doing very like producer type things. I was raising money, I was organizing, and I think if you stop kind of being creative and writing and using that muscle, you kind of lose that muscle. And I think that's what had happened. And so I wasn't getting all these ideas anymore of like what I was going to make. And so I think what took it was my dad had told me this real story of this invasive plant that had been growing out in the desert, where he was working as a volunteer botanist. And that triggered something, because it was like this connection to him. And I'd spent my childhood actually spending a lot of time in the desert with my parents. We would always go to the desert. And so the desert was this very special place to me. And so I could almost see instantly the whole story kind of put together and visualize it. I knew it was going to be a compelling place. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously it took a lot of time. It wasn't like the first draft was, okay, it's done. It was several years of writing and revisioning and getting feedback from people to make it a really strong film. But I almost think there was something about taking all this time off and having some more life experience, doing some other stuff, that then gave me even more kind of power behind it to then be able to go and write something really strong when I had that idea that I was really excited about.
How long did it take you to write the first draft?
It probably took maybe 6 to 7 months maybe for our first draft. I mean, I wasn't writing it every day or anything like that, I mean, it probably took longer than it would if I was going to just sit down and do it now or something, right? But then from there, I probably spent another year to two refining it and doing a few more versions of it. Maybe not quite that long, but at some point in there, I had started to get the idea that I needed to do this proof of concept. And so I think I was working on the proof of concept while always continuing to refine the feature too. And I mean, you're still rewriting and changing things even while you're filming and beyond, and so you're never finished with it. But it definitely, I think, took many rounds of getting feedback and revisions to kind of get it to a place where it was ready to really share and be something you could send out to everyone.